Yeah, all right. So I am so glad to be here to share with you some of the work that I've done over the past 7 years. Reading, listening, attending classes, researching and searching for the story of America's wars, and then writing. After I got a good look at the history, I had to go on to how we got where we are, how it's been going for us, and what this all means for our future and the future of the world. But first, a story about two frogs. Frogs, as we know, are cold-blooded animals whose body temperature adapts to the surroundings, the temperature around them. We humans shiver or sweat or put on coats, but the frogs adapt. I must admit that there's disagreement about the science behind this frog fable, or at least about the shape of the pot and the speed of the rising heat. So I'll tell it as I heard it, but with some adaptions for this criticism. There once was a frog, a fine green frog, and a fine blue frog as well. One early morning, when the cabin door was left ajar, the two frogs hopped right onto the porch, and from the porch into the front room. Green Frog, being curious as he was, leapt into the kitchen, up on the cold old iron wood stove, and into a big pot of nice cool water where the lima beans were soaking overnight. Green Frog wiggled down into the cool bean water and started playing with those limas, perhaps dreaming about a new game he might invent, and eventually and softly then riveting himself to sleep. Blue Frog, however, preferring the quiet and solitude of a corner, settled on a log in the woodpile next to the stove. When Granny opened her eyes that morning and saw that the sun was up, she arose and built a fire in the wood stove. Eventually, but still quite slowly, because there was no rush, the big pot of lima beans began to warm up, and so did Green Frog, adapting his temperature to the temperature of the water around him. An hour or two later, or maybe 3, Blue awakened, croaked for Green, and in one huge leap bounded smack dab into the lima green pot right beside Green. "Holy cow, Green," she croaked. "It's hotter than blazes in here. What in the world are you doing?" And Blue leapt off those limas in a split second, straight back onto the woodpile. Green peered over the pan. "What's the trouble?" he asked. "I don't think you noticed, Green, but you are definitely in hot water, exceedingly hot water, dangerously hot water, and if you stay where you are, you will surely croak." For you see, Blue instantly felt the heat that Green had simply not noticed as he gradually became accustomed to his surroundings. Besides, Green had been busy planning his new lima bean game and was distracted. The fable can end as you choose. Version 1, Green settles back into the gently heating pan of beans, thinking Blue is just being overdramatic and crying wolf, still not noticing the change in temperature until dinner is served, lima beans and cooked frog. Or version 2, because Blue saw and felt in his own toes what was happening and spoke boldly, Green came to realize the truth. Things were going terribly wrong. He had become conditioned to the slowly rising heat around him. And lest he boil with the beans, Green heeded Blue's warning and his own inner wisdom, and Frog leaped right out of that pot. In this version, both of the frogs, of course, live happily ever after, along with all other green frogs who heard of the close call and thenceforth are determined to be frogs who do not simply ignore or adapt to disaster, but act before it is too late. Are we, by chance, green frogs? Are we getting so used to the lima bean pot, which we've mostly lived in all our lives, that it's almost impossible to notice that things are terribly wrong? I would like to propose that this is exactly our situation, but I also propose that we, like Green Frog, have a choice to make about war. I looked at each major war in U.S. history, the background, what each side said about their reasons for going to war, and what alternatives were known then or now that were not chosen. I learned a lot more than just the story of wars. I saw how war was sold so that people who wouldn't normally accept violence, destruction, and cruelty as a means of resolving conflict would buy into war and decide that they had no choice. I saw that there are some major myths about war that were passed along as truth. I also discovered examples of serious conflicts being resolved without war or violence. I hadn't heard so much, if anything, about those. I began to feel strongly that America had a right to know the truth, and that if we knew the truth, things would change. I can't take us through each war this morning, but let me just say that I think you will find it a startling, fascinating, disgusting, and very powerful journey. I'd like to mention a few things that will give you a taste of what is to be discovered. My personal opinion is that America got off on the wrong foot. The colonists had become amazingly innovative and creative in defying what they believed to be unfair treatment. They refused to cooperate. They networked like crazy. When they were told they couldn't meet as a legislature, they adjourned to the tavern nearby and carried on with their work. When they were told they had to pay damages for that tea in the harbor, they refused to pay. They created alternative forms of administration. They refused to pay for and affix a stamp that was required to make all kinds of paper legal. They would not fear the power of unjust laws. They boycotted imported goods. They made their own herbal tea rather than pay the tax on imported tea. And they learned to spin wool for clothing rather than buy British cloth. They kept it up until the British merchants across the sea lost too much money and demanded changes by their parliament. What would have been the course of our nation if they had continued creating and using acts of nonviolent resistance? What if they had refused to pick up guns and start a bloody revolutionary war, but also refused to give in to what they saw was injustice? Instead of thousands killed in an 8-year war that cost millions of dollars even back then and resulted in a huge national debt and heavy taxes, could we have become world practitioners of nonviolence? Would we have defined heroism, courage, and patriotism as that way of acting with dignity and skill that had become ours from our birth as a nation, non-violently? What a heritage that would have been for us and for the world. We would not have had wars such as the Mexican-American War, about which Ulysses S. Grant would later say, "To this day, I regard that war as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. It was an instance of a republic following the bad example of European monarchies in not considering justice in their desire to acquire more territory." The story of the Indian Wars and those things that happened around Dayton and Lafayette and Grand Round and the coast are unconscionable. We learn about U.S. bankers' loans to England that impacted our entry into World War I, and on, always justified in terms of protecting our freedom. Freedom to do what exactly? I began to wonder. We don't know how our government's use of nuclear bombs in World War II and today's continued modernization of US nuclear weapons will play out in the future. But to me, it is a very frightening example of green frog in the lima bean pod saying, what's the problem? So if America's story of war is actually pretty awful, and it is, why is it that war sold and sells and keeps selling? First, fear sells war. Then I name 7 other reasons, but I'll shorten it to number 1 and 7 today. Number 1, we take away the humanity of the other side. They become the enemy. The enemy we have to feed enemy pie to. A dirty yellow Jap, a kraut, a gook, and yes, a terrorist. They have no story we need to know, these evil ones. Number 7, money spent for war isn't real money. How much is the $977,121,986,000 we spent on the military in 2008? It is $1.9 million every minute of that year. But how much is 1.9 million? We also get sucked into myths, and we start believing they are true. Myths like, things will never change, war is inevitable. Not so. Things change. It was said that the honor of gentlemen would always demand dueling. Andrew Jackson, who became president of the United States, shot and killed the man who spread a rumor about his wife Rachel by dueling. Yes, thankfully, things change. Or, I'm just one person. I can't make a difference anyway, so why try? Not so. Every act makes some ripple. You can make a difference. Or, governments have the right to wage war. I contend that the right to wage war is a right no more suited to governments, no more for the good of humanity, and no more an example of effective, just problem solving than for us to grant to physicians the right to poison children. Because governments and physicians are groups that have the power and resources to accomplish the named task, in no way means that it is logical or wise. Should school janitors be given the right to set schools on fire? Should farmers be given the exclusive right to slaughter horses as they are born? Because we can does not mean we should. We get tied up on the exclusive right part of things and forget to notice that we are talking nonsense. I encourage you to get seriously curious about Hitler and how he came to power and how he was stopped and by whom along the way, and see what you think. Because Hitler is the #1 reason I hear people say we must ever be ready to go to war and we must never shortchange our military preparedness. But do we really need 210 times more uniformed military than the total of our Foreign Service Diplomatic Corps and our overseas development workers combined? Do we need substantially more people employed as musicians in defense bands than in the entire Foreign Service? Priorities impact results. I want America to learn the stories of nonviolent action and of hard, creative work that made war totally unnecessary in conflicts that could have turned to war in less skilled hands. Because then we'll say, well, maybe that could happen again if we gave it a try. Stories like what President Truman did in 1948 to prevent a return to the devastation of World War II. The USSR had blockaded West Berlin so that all shipments of supplies into the city were cut off. They were determined to force the West to abandon the city and leave it to Soviet control. Truman could have been tough and declared that the US of A was not going to be run over by power-grabbing communists. He could have sent troops in to enforce the terms of the agreement. Instead, he started an airlift of supplies into Berlin. The Air Force flew in over 2 million tons of food, coal, water, and other supplies. And after some months, the Soviets realized the airlift could go on indefinitely, and their blockade was futile. They quit. They dropped the blockade. War was avoided. Estonia used a national tradition of folk singing to bring people together by the tens of thousands and more to acknowledge their power as a people. When the numbers outgrew the streets and parks where they were gathering, they went to their traditional folk music festival grounds and determined that they would redeclare their independence and stand together until they gained it, non-violently. They stood together against tanks and armed soldiers, and with the moral power of knowing they were in the right, their independence was regained. What happened afterwards is an equally fascinating story to learn. Paul Wee, a Lutheran pastor who had visited Guatemala during their horrendous civil war, made a promise to himself to try to do something to help. Though there were many players who eventually joined the peace effort, everyone acknowledged that peace would not have come to Guatemala then without Pastor Paul Wee and the Lutheran World Federation through which he worked. Christian women from Liberia teamed up with their Muslim sisters and demanded a stop to the civil war there by protesting and telling stories of what war had done to them and their families. They demanded that the men running it all start talking peace, but they didn't stop there. They followed them out of the country to where the peace talks were held and barricaded them in the building until they stopped vacationing and got serious about peace. There are lists and lists of these kinds of actions, stories that can be models and inspiration for nonviolent, effective action in really tough circumstances. Research on oppression and the struggle for independence since 1900 conclusively shows that nonviolent civil resistance has been more effective than war and more often results in democratic systems being in place after the struggle ends. Nonviolence works better and ends better than war. Now that is a story to learn. There are many alternatives ready to be used. We must ask why the US government lobbies for or buys the vote of countries in the United Nations to do what we want instead of truly seeking the wisdom of those representatives of the world's people, engaging them in working together for solutions. What about the US Institute of Peace, an official US governmental center of learning and practice? How often are they turned to for proposals and options in comparison to the military advisors? What about university programs in international conflict resolution, lifelong practitioners of peacemaking around the world, and diplomats worldwide? What if we said every potential war must wait while these groups come up with 3 alternatives, and then we'll compare those plans with the consequences, the cost, and the destruction of war, and we'll see which makes the most sense. An Army doctor in Vietnam helped me understand what war was like for him and the woman he tried to help and her baby. That's our own Phil Newman. And I asked Phil if I could share this, even though he couldn't be here today. The experience for all of us at the 18th was that since we had the only pediatric hospital run by the military in Vietnam, and since we also chose to operate on civilians when time allowed, we had, I think, a heightened appreciation of the impact of the war on the civilian population. My wife was pregnant when I left for Vietnam. My first case there was a 20-something Vietnamese woman in her last trimester of her first pregnancy who got up in the middle of the night to void. She went out into a field and stepped on a French landmine that had been laying there since the 1950s. This was 1970. She came in with both legs gone and multiple abdominal injuries. I operated on her for 5 hours, but she died on the table along with the fetus. I will never forget her or that family. I would have liked them to have been there on the panel at Linfield College. I would have told that story, but I didn't think I could share it. Maybe next time. I used to think if everyone got to spend 1 week in a surgical hospital during an offensive, we would never have to worry about countries going to war. Phil's wrenching memories echoed those of a nurse who spoke about the Vietnam experience after a college drama at Linfield some time earlier. She said, "I knew absolutely nothing was worth this. The mangled bodies we were supposed to fix up. I don't care what the problems were. Nothing was worth this." So what do we do? My hope would be that everyone of high school age or above would assign themselves a book to read on the subject of war and international problem solving, just to spark their understanding and their questioning. It doesn't have to be my book, but it has to be powerful and honest. Or study the website worldbeyondwar.org. There's some amazing reading there to do. Then figure out what you want to do about war. Because whether we admit it or not, we are a part of America's story of war. And you can do something, and it will make a difference. If you think you might want to join together with some others here who would like to start by reading and discussing this book, then do it. I put a sign-up sheet on that table back there, and I will help coordinate gatherings for discussion after we've had a time to read. Take a copy of my bookmark, also back there on the table, called Opposites. Read it out loud to someone and ask their opinion of it. Take a lima bean from the pot here or the back table, just to remind you of green frogs. Grab a marker and write on that bean the date by which you will do one thing. Most of all, let us begin to question. We don't all have to reach the exact same conclusions. We don't all have to do the exact same things, but we will be changed and we will be more aware. Remembering green frogs, we can understand it is our human tendency to adapt, to become numb and distracted, and to feel powerless. But we will also remember, we also do not have to stay in the pot of lima beans just because we inherited it. We can pause and test the water, evaluate the heat, and decide when it's time to leap. Some days, we may be blue frog and say to others, "Holy cow, we are in hot water, let's go." Because there is a family in Iraq named Qasim who deserve our voice. although their 4 children, Mara, Gufram, Mohammed, and Zainab, have all been buried. There is a beautiful young man named David Weisenberg from Portland who deserves our voice, though he is gone. And his family still hurts forever for that loss. It is my belief that we must speak the truth about war boldly. War is destructive, war is wasteful, war is cruel. War reinforces the use of violence and power over others. War is unworthy of humankind. War encourages War carries within it the seeds of resentment and retaliation. War reinforces the use of violence and power over others. Power is not a substitute for justice. War is unworthy of humankind. We can build new habits if we choose to do so. We can find alternatives. Many are here now, ready to be used. One conflict, resolved without violence, builds potential for another, and another, and another. It is time. It's time for a world beyond war. I invite you into the change. I believe that someday you will be able to say, you know, I helped end war on this planet, and this is what I did. And I'm so glad I did it. Thanks.
Today we're going to find some peace through meditation for just a short period of time. If you will join with me and close your eyes. And the first thing we're going to do is take a very slow breath in, hold it, and then out. And we'll do that 3 times. Right? We're already more relaxed than we were a minute ago. But let's just let our bodies get very heavy in the chair. That means relaxing muscles, feeling your own body's weight sink into the chair. And just being here in a very solid way. Now we can think or not. If we think, let's think about how we can bring more peace to where we live in the world. We'll start now. We do have some time to ask Kathy questions, about 5 minutes, or make a comment. I know we all appreciated what she said, but it can be a dialogue. So, does anyone? Oh, thank you.
So many people do not know the history of this country and the history of why World War II and things like that started. Thank you for bringing that up, because I know of it because I love history and I love studying it, but so many people have no idea.
Thank you. And the subtitle of this book is What America Missed in U.S. History Class and What We All Can Do Now. And I admit that I wasn't a big student of history, and I had missed so much. As I read and studied, I thought, oh my golly, oh my gosh, you are kidding. And so I think it's a really interesting story, one that we as Americans need to understand better.
Hi, Kathy.
Hi.
Thank you so much for sharing. I had a question in general for all of us, with all the access to what's happening around the world. And for you, especially focusing on what you focus on and reading and researching, how do you process all the stuff that you're taking in so that you're sleeping and continually putting one foot in front of the other?
Thank you, Anna. I'm not sure that I always keep it in balance. Patricia Fay was just telling me before we started that her way is to hold on to hope and do things so that she's living within that hope. And I suppose as I feel that I'm doing something, I begin to think, okay, I am not in charge of the timeline or everyone else, but I will do what I can, and I do believe in that thing of ripples and that things will come. So for me, I think it got down to saying, okay, what is the one thing you're going to do? And I took 3 Lima beans myself, and on one of them I wrote July 5th, that's my birthday, and I'm going to figure out something to do that day to make the world more peaceful. And the other one I wrote next Tuesday, because that's my little grandson's way of saying something that isn't happening that day, maybe it'll happen next Tuesday. And so that's sometime in the future. And then I wrote May 29th, I'm going to do something that day. So I don't know for sure how we keep the power and the energy, but I think it's in hearing someone that heads off to Nicaragua with their family that encourages me, and other people that, show up, a whole crew of us on zero waste, to recycle things. So if we keep doing it, I think we'll find maybe not balance, but at least hopefulness, and we'll make a change. I don't know, Anna, I'll learn from you.
This was really encouraging to me today, and I usually sit through things like this and I don't feel encouraged because it's like I'm cynical, and it's like, so I have this big war going on inside of me with my cynicism. But I sat here today and listened to you and your perspective on history that I haven't heard before, like from day one with the Boston Tea Party and all that. And it's like, yeah, that makes so much sense. Just look at it from a new perspective. So I'm seeing a war that's going on in my family from a different perspective. And that's where the cynicism hits me, is where does the rubber meet the road with my own relatives? So my question to you today is, how do you combat the war being taught to our children through video games and books and movies? And I have become overwhelmed with trying to counter that, and that's part of the family problems. One is a warmonger, and I'm getting into nonviolence, and we're clashing. So do you see what I'm trying to say? As how do you respectfully fit within families that believe in war?
Thanks, Deb. I would say, if I were to describe it, that I come from a military family. My dad joined the Army, wanted to go to the Philippines, was very supportive of that, and we grew up seeing the picture of him in his uniform. My brother's career military, full-time, retired now. I had nephews in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I began to believe and understand probably, well, and I was there. I was telling Madeline before I came back to McMinnville, and someone handed me a brochure about a group called McMinnville Peacemakers, which is now Yamhill Valley Peacemakers. I don't know that I had ever used the word peace, you know. Wayne and I were in the Peace Corps. It was Vietnam time. I didn't know a thing about Vietnam. I just didn't want him to be drafted. I wanted to come back and work at a boys' home and not have to worry about him going to Vietnam and what that would mean for our lives. So it wasn't my story either. Somehow I believe that, for one thing, one of the things of this Peacemakers group here locally was parenting for peace and justice. It was applied to how we do things with our kids. And so it began to change my life. I know our kids were in a parade with daffodils one time, walking the streets of McMinnville with a whole bunch of other people protesting nuclear war. And I talked to our youngest, Kip, and I said, as I'm working on this, I don't want people to think I'm some kind of freaky peacenik that was born with a protest sign in my hand. I want them to think, that I understand where we're all coming from. And he said, no, Mom, that wasn't you, that was us. He was 2 when I was going down, and I don't know that he carried the sign, but I did, and he had to walk with me because, I wanted to take care of him, up and down Main Street protesting bombing in Iraq. And he has a little sign that he did make. Kids are hurt by bombs, don't do it. So somehow I think the history will work, but also you work in communication, and I think that's the other part of it, somehow keeping those lines of communication open with our families.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Probably. Well, let's give a big thanks to Kathy again.